Did you know that there were once civilizations right here in North America? Like massive civilizations. And get this, they thrived for over 1,000 years. That's even longer than the US has been around.
It's a really long time. And yeah, their achievements were pretty incredible.
It really puts things in perspective, right? Like when you think about it, in 1290, one of their major cities, Cahokia, it was actually larger than London was back then. Can you imagine?
It's mind-blowing, really. And I think it challenges some of our preconceived notions about North America before European contact.
Yeah,
We often think of it as this vast, untamed wilderness, but that's not the whole picture. There were incredibly complex and advanced societies thriving here.
exactly. So, in this deep dive, we're going to dig into the story of the Mound Builders. They were this ancient and sophisticated culture, and their story is right here, woven into the very fabric of this land.
And it's a story that has connections to so many different aspects of American history and culture.
For sure. We're going to be working from a really detailed educational supplement that we found. And our goal is to kind of pull out the most important stuff, the key insights, so you can get a good grasp of who these people were and what their lives were like. But we don't want to get too bogged down in the academic jargon. We want to keep it interesting.
Absolutely. I think one of the most fascinating things about the Mound Builders is how much they can teach us about the deep roots of innovation and cultural development on this continent. It's a story that has relevance all the way to the present day.
Totally. We'll be exploring their mounds, which are, let's face it, still kind of mysterious in some ways. We'll look at their art, their belief systems, and this is super important how they're connected to the tribes we know today. Okay, let's start unpacking all of this. First things first. Who exactly were the mound builders?
So the term mound builder, it's not actually the name of a single tribe. It's more like an umbrella term.
Okay, so it encompasses a bunch of different groups.
Exactly. It refers to a whole network of American Indian groups, and over a period of, get this, like 3,000 years, they shared these similar cultural values and beliefs, particularly the whole mound building thing.
Wow, 3,000 years is a long time. So it wasn't just one specific group, but a bunch of different groups that were connected by these common practices.
Exactly. Think of it like a complex web of interconnected societies, kind of like a confederation. They weren't necessarily a single unified nation, but they shared this cultural thread.
That makes sense. And their influence wasn't just limited to one tiny area, was it? It seems like they covered a pretty significant chunk of the continent.
You're right. Their presence was felt across a vast territory from what we now know as Florida all the way up to Pennsylvania, and then westward from Wisconsin down to Oklahoma.
That's huge.
It is. And within this immense area, there were four major centers that kind of acted as hubs: Cahokia in Illinois, Moundville in Alabama, Etowah in Georgia, and Spiro in Oklahoma. But here's the thing. These weren't just isolated cities. They were all linked. Trade, travel, the exchange of ideas, cultural practices, it all flowed between them.
So a vast network of interconnected communities spanning centuries. Talk about leaving a mark on history. Okay, you mentioned specific time periods earlier. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. The mound building, it didn't all happen at once. There were distinct archaeological periods. We have the Archaic period, which kicks off around 2000 BCE. Then we move into the Woodland period, which lasted from roughly 200 BCE to 300 CE.
But the one that's really famous, the one that really stands out, is the Mississippian period. That was from about 850 to 1500 CE.
So the Mississippian period is kind of the star of the show when it comes to the mound builders.
It is. It represents their peak in terms of population size, geographic spread, and just their overall cultural achievements. Think sophistication, organization, complexity, the whole nine yards. Okay, so we're talking big numbers here when we say population, right?
Oh, yeah. During that peak Mississippian period, there were probably over 1 million people. And in cities like Cahokia, there might have been as many as 20,000 residents. That's incredible for that time period.
That's bigger than a lot of European cities back then. Crazy.
I know. And that's part of what makes the mound builders so fascinating. They were achieving this level of urban development right here in North America.
Right here in our backyard, so to speak. Okay, so a lot of people, a huge area, and a long time. But let's talk about the mounds themselves. I mean, they didn't just appear out of nowhere, right?
We got it. The mounds, they weren't just accidental piles of dirt. These were engineered structures, carefully planned, designed, and built. Think of it like this. Imagine moving tons and tons of earth, all by hand, basketful by basketful, to create these massive structures.
That must have taken forever.
Oh, it did. And here's the thing. Many of them weren't built all at once. They were layered, added to over time, sometimes decades or even centuries apart. Can you imagine working on a project that your great-great-grandchildren might finish one day?
That's incredible. It shows a long-term vision for sure.
It does. And it speaks to the importance of these mounds for their communities. They weren't just temporary structures, they were lasting monuments, testaments to their beliefs, their social structures, their connection to the land.
So these mounds, they weren't all cookie cutter replicas of each other, right? There was variety, right?
Oh yeah, tons of variety. Some were pretty basic low rises, but others were absolutely colossal. Take Monk's Mound at Cahokia. It's huge. Its base and volume are actually larger than the Great Pyramid in Egypt.
Really? Larger than the pyramids. Wow.
No kidding. And then you have the effigy mounds, which are mainly found in the Ohio River Valley. Those are shaped like animals. You can only really appreciate them from the air, though. They're like these giant earthwork sculptures, messages etched onto the landscape.
Okay, so different shapes and sizes. But what were they actually used for? What was their purpose?
Well, there were different types of mounds, each with its own function. For instance, there were temple mounds.
Temple mounds.
Yeah, these were like flat-topped pyramids, and they were primarily used for the homes of leaders and for ceremonies. A good example is Brown Mound at the Spiro site. It was a major temple mound. Then there were burial mounds.
Makes sense.
Yeah, like Craig Mound, also at Spiro. Those were specifically for burying elite members of society, and they often had all sorts of cool artifacts buried with them. Then there were those effigy mounds we talked about, shaped like animals. And then you also had observation mounds.
What were those for?
Well, those seem to have been positioned strategically, maybe for tracking the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. And finally, there were the simpler hill mounds.
So they were tracking celestial events. That suggests a pretty good understanding of astronomy.
It does, doesn't it? A lot of the mounds seem to have been intentionally aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. That shows a pretty high level of astronomical knowledge.
And they were incorporating that knowledge into their architecture and their society.
Exactly. And, going back to the temple mounds for a second, their height and placement, it wasn't just practical, it was symbolic too.
How so?
Well, elevating the leaders, literally putting them above everyone else, that reinforced their authority, their status, both physically and symbolically. It's a pretty powerful statement, right?
Definitely. So the mounds were more than just physical structures. They were tied to their worldview, to their whole understanding of the universe.
Absolutely. The mounds reflected their cosmology, their social structure, their beliefs. They were a tangible expression of their culture in so many ways.
Okay, so speaking of their worldview, what else do we know about mound builder culture? Their level of knowledge, their innovations, all that stuff. We've already talked about some pretty amazing things.
And those amazing things point to a really sophisticated culture. One of the keys to their success was their agriculture. They were amazing farmers.
What did they grow?
Well, a lot of things, but one of their main staples was what we call the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. It's a really efficient system because those plants actually help each other grow. The corn provides support for the beans to climb, the beans fix nitrogen in the soil, and the squash helps to suppress weeds and conserve moisture.
That's pretty smart. So they had a really reliable food supply thanks to this system.
Exactly. And that allowed them to support larger populations and to have some people specialize in other things besides just farming. You had artisans, warriors, religious leaders, and all stems from that stable agricultural base.
So just like we see in other advanced societies, a surplus of food leads to specialization and more complex social structures.
Exactly. And speaking of social structures, their political organization was also pretty impressive. We're talking about large populations spread across huge territories, sometimes tens of thousands of people. How do you manage that?
Good question. How did they do it?
Well, they had systems of leadership that often involved what you might call second chiefs or governors who were in charge of specific regions.
Okay, like regional leaders. And then above them.
Above them was the primary leader, sometimes called the Meko. Now, here's a fascinating thing. In some societies, leadership was passed down through the mother's side of the family. Matrilineal inheritance. That's pretty cool.
That's really interesting. Not what you typically see in like European societies of that time.
I know. It challenges our assumptions, right?
Yeah.
And these primary leaders, they were held in very high regard. Often they were considered to have a divine connection. Their word carried a lot of weight, social, religious, even economic.
So a well-defined hierarchy with a strong religious element. Fascinating. What about trade? You mentioned earlier that it was really important for connecting these different communities.
Trade was essential. It was how they exchanged goods, ideas, and cultural practices across these vast distances. And they had these incredible trade networks that crisscrossed the entire continent. Think of the major rivers like the Ohio, Tennessee, Red, Mississippi. They were like their highways, their arteries of commerce and communication. And they didn't just stick to rivers. There's evidence of coastal travel, too, along the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean.
So they were sailing up and down the coast as well.
Seems like it. And the archaeological discoveries at sites like Spiro, they just blow your mind. We're talking about materials found there that originated from all over what's now the U.S.
That's amazing. Like, how did they get stuff from so far away?
Yeah, they had boats, some of them up to 40 feet long, even equipped with sails. That's serious nautical technology for the time. That's how they moved goods and people and ideas over such long distances.
40-foot sailing vessels. That's impressive. It really highlights their engineering and navigational skills. And it makes you wonder, how did they communicate across these vast distances in different languages? I mean, were they all speaking the same language?
Probably not all the same language, but they did have a really clever way to communicate across linguistic differences. They used iconography, basically, a sophisticated system of symbols. Think of it like their own visual language.
So like a form of writing.
Sort of, like hieroglyphics, where specific symbols carry meaning, and you can combine them to tell stories or convey information. These symbols could communicate things about cultural beliefs, religion, political structures, even clan affiliations, and social status. It was a way of bridging those language barriers.
That's super smart, a visual language that everyone could understand. Did their iconography also reflect their worldview, their cosmology?
Oh, absolutely. Their cosmology, their understanding of the universe, was deeply embedded in their art and their beliefs. They had this concept of a tripartite cosmos, basically, a universe divided into three realms.
What were the three realms?
The underworld, the upper world, and the middle world. The middle world is where humans lived. This three-tiered view, it's everywhere in their art, in the engravings on shell gorgets, for example. And even their origin stories, like the Caddo narrative, reflect this idea of a three-part universe.
So this concept of the three worlds, it was central to their understanding of existence. What about specific symbols? Were there any key icons we see popping up in their art?
All the time. One of the most common ones is a cross inside a circle. It's thought to represent sacred fire, which they believe burned in all three realms. Then there's the cedar tree, often called the world tree. It's this vertical axis that connects the three levels of the cosmos.
That imagery is so powerful.
It is. And then you have the Birdman. You see that one a lot in their art. It's this figure with both bird and human characteristics, and it's usually associated with the upper world.
I've definitely seen that image. What did it represent?
Well, scholars think it often symbolized things like warfare, prestige, and high-stakes competition. It embodies this kind of male power and prowess, the striving to reach the highest levels.
So reaching for the upper world, striving for greatness, makes sense. Any other important symbols?
Oh yeah, tons. The serpent is a big one. It's often shown with horns, wings, or even as this underwater panther-like creature. That one is usually linked to the underworld and often represents a powerful, sometimes dangerous force. It's like the opposite of the Birdman, the force that keeps things grounded, that dwells in the depths.
A balance of power between the upper world and the underworld. I like that.
And then there's this image of a hand with an eye in the palm. Some people think it represents a portal to the other world, or maybe even a symbolic representation of the constellation Orion. It's a mystery that's still being debated.
So much symbolism. Did understanding these individual icons help them understand the bigger picture of their beliefs?
Totally. By recognizing those individual meanings, they could then interpret the overall message of a piece of art or a ritual object. It was like having a key to unlock the secrets, to see the connections between the different parts of their world. The art wasn't just decoration, it was a way of communicating their beliefs, their understanding of the cosmos, the balance between different forces.
It's incredible how much meaning they packed into these symbols. It really makes you appreciate their level of sophistication. Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about their daily lives. What was community life like for the Moundbuilders?
Community was everything. Their whole way of life was based on cooperation and shared responsibility.
It makes sense when you think about it. I mean, building those mounds that took a huge collective effort. And their agricultural system, their art, everything they accomplished, it all points to a really strong sense of community.
Absolutely. And like in any society, their daily lives revolved around family, work, social interaction, and participating in communal events and ceremonies. Think of it like this, Dee. Imagine you could travel back in time and visit a village near Spiro, say, 1,000 years ago.
Okay, I'm picturing it. What would I see?
Well, you'd see houses made of wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with clay, and roofs thatched with reeds or grass. Inside, you'd have a central hearth for cooking, warmth, and light. There would probably be raised platforms along the walls for sleeping and storage.
Cozy. And what about the layout of the village itself?
Most likely, it would be centered around a plaza, kind of like a public square, the heart of community life. And of course, you'd see the mounds. Brown Mound at Spiro, the biggest one, would have dominated the landscape.
So the mounds were really integrated into the fabric of their communities.
They were. And as you walk around, you might see people tending their fields, growing corn, beans, and squash. You might see craftspeople working, maybe carving designs into shells or shaping copper into beautiful ornaments. Hunters might be coming back from the forest with game. You'd hear the sounds of daily life, kids playing, people chatting, the rhythmic pounding of grinding stones.
It sounds so vibrant, so full of life.
It must have been. And then there would be community events, games, maybe preparations for ceremonies. Everything would revolve around that central plaza, bringing people together, strengthening their social bonds.
It really paints a picture of a thriving community. And you mentioned earlier that there was a hierarchy. Elites lived on top of the mounds, right? Were there other specific social roles?
Definitely. Beyond the general population and the elite, there were specialists. Priests, for example, had a lot of status and influence. They probably led ceremonies, kept traditions alive, maybe even had a role in record-keeping or astronomy. Think of the raccoon clan priest at Spiro. He was buried with all sorts of amazing artifacts, showing just how important these religious figures were.
They were the keepers of knowledge and tradition. Makes sense. Speaking of traditions, what about celebrations and rituals? I know the green corn ceremony was a big deal. Can you tell us more about that?
The green corn ceremony, also known as Paskativi, is still an important tradition for many tribes today, especially those in the southeast with mound builder ancestry. It's a time of renewal, purification, and giving thanks, usually celebrated around the time the first corn is ripe in late summer.
Like a harvest festival.
Yeah, kind of. It's a multi-day event with fasting, ritual cleansing, feasting on the new corn, and special dances like the stomp dance and the ribbon dance. And, importantly, they would rekindle a sacred fire, symbolizing a fresh start for the community.
Powerful imagery.
It is. And for many tribes who were forcibly removed from their homelands, carrying embers of their old fire to their new homes in Oklahoma added another layer of meaning. It represented that continuity of tradition, that unbroken connection to their past.
That connection to the past is so important. It's not just history, it's living heritage.
Right. And we have a really interesting perspective on Posket TV from Loretta Francis and her daughters. They still celebrate it today, and they talk about the fasting from corn until the ceremony and the importance of their traditional ceremonial grounds, TV Valvasi. It really highlights how these ancient practices are still alive and meaningful.
That's really inspiring. Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about their political systems. You mentioned the Miko earlier. Can you unpack their political structures for us?
So, we don't have a ton of written records for the Mississippian period itself, but luckily we have accounts from early French explorers who encountered the Natchez people in the early 1700s.
The Natchez.
Yeah, they were one of the last surviving Mississippian cultures, and their social structure was very similar. Their system was hierarchical, with a paramount chief at the top, known as the Great Sun, or Miko. They lived in their capital city, the Grand Village.
So like a king.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And this position was usually passed down through the mother's family matrilineal inheritance again. Right. And the Miko, they were super powerful. They had religious and political authority and were often considered divine. Their main job was to maintain harmony and balance in society through rituals and pronouncements. They also had a war chief, usually their brother, but there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that large-scale warfare was a defining feature of Mississippian society.
So a centralized leadership with a strong religious component.
Got it.
Got it. And you said that even though their specific forms of government have changed, some of these roles and ideas are still around in modern tribes.
Definitely. The structures have evolved, but some core principles and even titles remain. The Kealiji tribal town, which is part of the Muskogee Creek Nation, still uses the title Meko for their elected leader.
I love those echoes of the past in the present.
It's really fascinating, right?
Yeah.
And we even get to hear from Tiger Hobia, the current Meko of the Kealiji tribal town. He talks about his role serving the community, helping elders and families, and teaching the younger generations about their mound builder heritage.
I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, he's a great example of how those ancient traditions are still influencing leadership today. And speaking of which, the name Kealiji itself means mound people, highlighting that direct link to their past.
That's amazing. It shows how deeply rooted those connections are. Okay, another thing that really stood out to me was this game, Chunky. It sounds like it was a big deal. What can you tell us about it?
Chunky was huge. It was like their national sport, and it was super popular throughout the entire Mississippian world. We have evidence of it dating back to around 700 CE.
Okay, so what was it? How did you play?
So you'd have this specially prepared court, like a smooth clay surface, maybe 200 feet long. One player would roll this carefully crafted disc-shaped stone, the chunky stone, down this court. At the same time, other players would be running alongside, trying to predict where the stone would stop.
200 feet. That's pretty big. So how do you win?
As the stone is rolling, players throw spears or shoot arrows, trying to land them as close as possible to where they think the stone will stop. Whoever gets closest wins points.
Sounds like a combination of bowling and javelin. What was the atmosphere like at these games?
Oh, it was a big social event. People would come from miles around to watch these matches. Imagine these big crowds gathered around the court, cheering on their favorite players. The energy must have been incredible.
It sounds like a mix of a sporting event and a community festival. Was it just for fun, or is there more to it than that?
It was definitely more than just a game. Chunky often had social, economic, and even political significance. Matches were played between different towns, different social groups, and the stakes were high.
What kind of stakes?
People would bet personal belongings, but more importantly, there was prestige and even political influence on the line. Winners were highly respected, skilled, chunky players. They were like the star athletes of their day.
Makes sense. It's not just a game if your reputation and your community's standing are on the line. And what about the equipment? Those chunky stones sound pretty special.
They were. They were usually made from really hard, polished stones like quartzite, granite, or basalt, and they can be anywhere from 3 to 15 inches in diameter. We found tons of them at archaeological sites, which shows how popular chunky was. And sometimes you'd see images of chunky players on other artifacts.
Like little trophies commemorating those epic games.
Exactly. And, these stones, they weren't just personal possessions. They were often owned by whole villages, clans, or families. They were valuable heirlooms, passed down through the generations, almost like sacred objects.
Wow, so much history and meaning in a simple game. It's incredible. Sadly, we know that the classic mound builder culture didn't last forever. What led to their decline?
It's a complicated story, probably a combination of factors. Our educational supplement highlights one possible clue: the appearance of the armadillo in Spiro artwork around the time of that site's decline. Now, this timing coincides with a major climate shift that happened across North America around the 1300s. We're talking about big changes in rainfall patterns.
Climate change, huh? That's something we hear a lot about today. How did it affect the mound builders?
Well, this particular climate shift led to some really severe droughts, and that would have had a devastating impact on their agriculture. Crops would have failed, leading to food shortages.
And they relied so heavily on agriculture for their survival.
Exactly. It's likely that those prolonged droughts made it impossible to sustain the large populations in those big cities like Cahokia. So people started to move, leaving the big centers behind to form smaller, more self-sufficient communities.
So the droughts kind of forced them to adapt, to change their way of life.
It seems that way. And as those big cities were abandoned, that more integrated Mississippian culture began to fragment, and new tribal identities and social structures started to emerge.
So it wasn't a sudden disappearance, but more like a slow transformation in response to these environmental pressures.
Right, and that's an important distinction. And it's essential to remember that many modern-day tribes are the direct descendants of the mound builders.
That's such an important point. Their legacy lives on.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're talking about tribes like the Absentee Shawnee, the Caddo, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muskogee Creek, the Seminole, and many others. These tribes, they maintain a deep connection to their ancestral mound sites. Some even make pilgrimages to those places to honor their heritage.
It's like a living thread connecting the ancient past to the present. Their languages, their stories, their ceremonies, all these things carry echoes of their mound builder ancestors.
Exactly. It's an unbroken line.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so just to quickly recap everything we've talked about, we've explored the mound builders' incredible longevity, their impressive urban centers, their amazing mounds, their sophisticated agriculture and governance, their vast trade networks, and their unique systems of communication. We've delved into their cosmology, their community life, the significance of ceremonies like the green corn, the vital concept of tribal sovereignty, the fascinating game of Chunky, the environmental factors that led to their transformation, and their lasting legacy in so many modern tribes. It's been an incredible journey through time and culture.
It really has, and for me, it's sparked a desire to learn even more.
Me too. And for our listeners, if you're interested in digging deeper, a visit to the Spiro Archaeological Center in Oklahoma would be amazing. You could see these incredible artifacts firsthand.
Definitely. And we'll be sure to include a list of resources in the show notes. Places like the AICCM, the American Indian Cultural Center, and museum website is a great place to start. And of course, the websites of the many affiliated tribal nations have a wealth of information.
And each aspect of mound builder culture, we've touched on their astronomy, their art, their governance, their games. It could be a whole deep dive in itself. There's so much more to explore.
So much to learn. So as you're thinking about everything we've talked about, the mound builders' understanding of the cosmos, the scale of their constructions, the complexity of their societies, here's a final thought. Knowing that so many of today's tribes are descended from the mound builders, how do you think their unique perspectives and traditions might be shaping our understanding of North American history and culture today?
That's a really great question. I
Yeah.
think there's so much we can learn from them, from their deep connection to this land and their long history of resilience and adaptation.
It's a history that's still unfolding, still being written, and it's a story that deserves to be told and understood.